Okay, now let's review the basics of components. Components are what all of our polygonal objects are made out of. So, normally you'll see this thing highlighted in green. This means I'm in object mode and I'm selecting the entire object. There are a couple of ways to getting into component mode. One of them is to look up here. You will see three little buttons. One is about hierarchies and combinations. The other is object type, and the other is component type, which allows you to select individual components. You can also go to your modeling toolkit, and up here you have various options for the various components. Personally, I prefer just to right click over objects. Let's hold it down, and you'll see three in particular: vertex, edge, and face. Vertex face has its uses, but we're not going to go into that much here. Multi is for selecting multiple types. We'll get into that later on. UV is mostly to do with texturing, and then there's object mode to go back to grabbing the entire object. So, a vertex is just a point in space. That's these little purple dots right here. All it is a coordinate. It has an x, a y, and a z value. It's just this place. And as you move it around, you can see it affects the edges and faces it's connected to. It is a zero-dimensional object. It has no actual scale of any sort. After that, we have our edges. One-dimensional objects. All they have is length, because they just go from point A to point B, connecting two vertices. And once again, if I move this around and manipulate it, you'll see it affects the faces next to it. And of course, faces are these big flat objects that make up our polygons, which I should say, they are polygons. They make up our polyhedrons, which is the combination of them, the three-dimensional versions. And they're just these paper-thin faces that are connected together to form 3D objects. So, as I grab my polygons, I can adjust the shape of my object. And as we get into more tools for creating polygons, we'll actually start to add more and more. By default, as you make an object, remember, you can start by giving it as much complexity as you want, going into Polycube 1 here and looking for its subdivisions. The more subdivisions something has, the more complicated it is. So, with a 10 by 10 by 10, I get 100 times 6 polygons. That's a whole lot more detail to mess around with. And just briefly, it's worth doing our little face recap. If you remember our wonderful, beautiful, ugly face man. Here's a sphere made of a whole bunch of faces. And a reminder, polygons have to be completely flat. This shape is always going to be flat no matter how you look at it, no matter what. To get a curved object, you need lots and lots of little little flat objects to make it look round. If you look carefully enough at video games, you'll eventually see little edges on people's faces and such. But games are getting more and more high poly, so the more there are, the harder it is to see. Anyway, it's worth going over this, going to your face mode, and selecting a few little bits and pieces of this guy's actual face to make our wonderful, happy, handsome men. Also remember, there are a whole lot of ways of selecting complicated components, complicated selections of components. So, one thing is, whenever you're in Maya and you want to drag a box around something, remember, if I'm just using my regular select tool here, if I drag a box and hit this sphere and just barely touch that cube, it gets them both the sphere and the cube. So if you drag a box, you want it to only include the stuff you're looking for. You don't want to accidentally hit something more than you want. And if I hold down Shift, I can add to my selection or subtract from it. Also, if you hold down Control, you'll always subtract. We'll go over a few tips of this later on, but try doing something like this, where you intentionally grab a whole bunch of faces by holding down Shift, and pretend you've made a mistake, and say I want to remove some. Hold down Control, just to cull from your selection. Typically in Maya, you shouldn't have to click, 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 click. If you're click, 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 clicking a lot, chances are there's some way you can do it faster. Most of these commands, even with complicated selections, can be done in 2 or 3 clicks. So, for example, if I hold down Tab, I can click and drag on the object. I'm in face mode, grabbing those faces, to paint out complicated selections. That was 3 clicks, much faster. Also, you can do things like, for example, I want to select just the faces on this first half of the object, but the selection box will pass all the way through. If I hit 4 and I'm in wireframe mode, I can see my selection box carves all the way through and hits the other side. So if you've selected, let's say I just want these 9 faces right here. One box grabs them. On the other side I've got more than I want. You can hold down Control and drag another box to remove. So if you're making any complicated selection, try to think of ways to maybe overdo it and then cut back in order to make complicated selections without having to go click, 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 click. You should be able to drag a few boxes and get nice selections. Another few little tips. Mostly, we want our geometry to involve edge loops. We'll go over creating those later on, but an edge loop is basically, if I go to edge right here, and if I double click on this, you'll see it's selected a whole bunch of these edges all in a row around the orb. That's because this one has 2 edges and connects, 2 edges connects, 2 edges connects, 2 edges connects. They just keep on repeating this symmetry over and over again so they can form this nice loop that travels around the object. If I double click on one of these, it dead ends at the pole where it goes from 2 neighbors, 2 neighbors, 2 neighbors to suddenly having 18 neighbors, but it reaches a good long distance. So if you're looking for complicated selections like selecting every single bit around a row right here, I'll make my poor man's Pokeball. Also, with faces, a couple little tricks, like if you click one face, hold down Shift and double click one next to it, it'll make a loop. Or, if you want to select just these 4, and maybe you don't want to drag a box and remove what's behind it, click on one, hold down Shift, double click on the end, and it'll get everything along that way. There are a whole bunch of tips you'll learn throughout this class about how to select components a bit faster. Also, if I jump over to the top 5 buttons, far left one, that's my modeling toolkit, there are a couple of nice options for selecting complicated shapes like symmetry. So if I turn on my symmetry right here, I've got options. Let's try Object X. If you're confused about what the X, Y, Z mean in the world, always check down here for your little compass. That'll show you the world X, Y, Z. I can also see when I have my move tool on X, Y, and Z of the object match the world. It's possible that if it's rotated, they won't anymore, although right now the move tool is actually corresponding to the world as opposed to the actual object. If I go to my tool settings just briefly, axis orientation for my move tool, it says world. I can change it to object, and this is the actual XYZ illustrated on the object. You don't need to be able to do that little trick with the tool just yet, but let's rotate you back to zeros. Just going to type in some zeros. Channel box rotates zeros, now it's all flat. If I turn on symmetry Object X, I should be able to see whatever I select is mirrored on the other side, left to right. So this will allow me to select a face a lot faster, twice as fast. Also, if you're selecting components and you hit B, this is your soft select. You can go into your tool settings and find the soft selection options in here. It's much more complicated, but it's pretty simple. If you tap B and see this yellow stuff going out to black. Yellow is total control, black is no control, so this one face, I will grab it and move it totally, and the things around it a little less. That's moving half as much as this, and this isn't moving at all. If you hold down B and drag left and right, and pardon me, my computer's getting loud, it's hot, you can expand how far you reach, and you can start to sculpt your object. Hold down B, left mouse click. You can adjust your soft selection as you wish. So, in reviewing, right click, vertex, edge, and face are mostly the components you want to mess with, and object mode is how you grab the entire object as a whole. So, continue to have some fun and make some weird face meshes out of spheres.